I'm Sasha Polako-Saransky, Deputy Editor at Foreign Policy, and in my new show, I bring together diplomats, journalists, academics, and activists from across the globe.
I think it's an act of war. Lots of countries go to war.
And give them the chance to debate serious issues that really get to the heart of the world's biggest dilemmas.
That's not true. Look, diplomacy has been going on.
That's Counterpoint, a new podcast from Foreign Policy in partnership with the Doha Forum. Available now, wherever you get your podcasts.
But what is equally bad is when the system is slowly eroded through corruption. When the Roman state actually collapses, the collapse is actually it lasts just 25 years. Because you have a state that is, so powerful in 1181 that it stretches from Croatia to Syria. It's a very, very powerful state, probably among, if not the most powerful state in Europe, and certainly in the region it occupies. 25 years later, it's gone. And it's gone because the institutions and the ways that the state worked had been hollowed out over the preceding 100 years. And Rome had the benefit of good leadership until 1181. And then, as soon as you got bad leadership in, the whole thing just came apart very, very quickly.
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean C. Fettig. And welcome to our final episode of the year, our third annual State of the Union. So, as is tradition, we're bringing back three friends of the pod, judicial scholar Dr. Sara Benesh to discuss the state of the American judiciary and Supreme Court, researcher of ancient Rome and its fall, Dr. Edward Watts, to discuss how the fall of Rome can inform the current state of our American Union and what we might expect, and expert on political violence, Dr. James Hawdon. As Dr. Watts explained in his book, The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome, the Roman system didn't collapse in a single dramatic moment. It eroded gradually as democratic norms gave way to strongman politics, as the Senate became a rubber stamp for executive power, and as political violence became an accepted tool for achieving political ends. Like Rome in its later years, we're witnessing the slow-motion degradation of institutions that we once thought were secure and stable and unimpeachable. Rome's transformation from republic to autocracy wasn't marked by the abolition of democratic institutions, but by their hollow preservation as facades for concentrated power. Today, we're seeing similar attempts to maintain the appearance of democratic process while simultaneously gutting its substance, from efforts to create alternate slates of electors in 2020 to the systematic targeting of election officials who refuse to find additional votes. The January 6th attack on the Capitol wasn't just an assault on a building. It was like Sulla's march on Rome, a signal that political violence had become a legitimate tool in the eyes of many. Trump's proposed nominees to key and critical federal posts are determined to undo government, not administer it. And some conservative justices on the Supreme Court openly flout judicial norms and ethics while ceding more and more power to the executive. So today's guests are going to, in turn, and in each of their respective fields of expertise, discuss what's gone wrong, what's going wrong, and how it might all play out as Donald Trump prepares to return to office. All right, if you like this episode or any episode, please give it a like, share, and follow on your favorite podcast platform, and or subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. And as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please feel free to email me at deepdivewithsean@gmail.com. Let's do a deep dive. Dr. Benesh, welcome back. How are you?
Sean, I'm just great.
Oh, that feels a little tinged with cynicism, sarcasm.
You read into it what you will.
Fair enough. So I think this is our third State of the Union. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. I've lost track. I've been on your show so many times.
Well, that is true.
Mm-hmm.
That could also speed up exponentially next year.
Oh, no. Poor everyone who listens.
But okay, let's do this.
Oh, man.
As of January 20th, Trump will once again have the presidency. He has pretty much bitch-slapped Congress into acquiescence, and that leaves us with the independent judiciary to save the country, to save our democracy. What say you about that?
We've talked about the court before, Sean.
A couple times. Rings a bell.
And we've talked about my concern about the court in its capacity to save democracy, especially given its recent proclivities to engage in political decision-making. So I'm not sure what to expect from our quote-unquote independent judiciary.
I've been thinking a lot about the justices, and I've been thinking about historical examples of when justices have surprised us. And I really feel like maybe I'm just flailing at this point and wish casting, but there is a part of me that feels like, given what we know about Trump, given, he's kind of tipped his hand a little bit in so much as he's affirmed for us that he is going to do what he says he was going to do. And he's tipped his hand in the form of his nominees for federal positions. And that makes me wonder if that might push a couple of conservative justices closer to the center because it's become more real. And in that scenario, if that were to happen, I wonder if those two justices might be Roberts and Barrett.
Yeah, I think that's I think if we are going to wish cast, those would be two of my, I don't know how to continue with this analogy or whatever we're doing. Those would be targets. I think that has been Kagan's focus, especially Barrett. And it seems to be the case that Kagan is focusing a lot of her oral argument attention on Barrett and attempting to get her to see things the way Kagan sees them. I think there are times when we see the conservative justices behaving in ways that are perhaps more restrained than we might expect them to in particular areas of the law. So Gorsuch behaves differently when it comes to Native rights. He also, interpreted the Civil Rights Act textually, but in a way that protected gays and lesbians in a way that we maybe didn't expect. I think there's room for some potential issues, but I'm not sure about the, placing the onus on the Supreme Court to guard against potential excesses of the Trump administration, given that we know the position in which the Supreme Court finds itself in terms of power and influence, and the degree to which we rely on goodwill, public support, legitimacy for the court to have power, and the extent to which the Trump administration, if history is any guide and if words have any meaning, to sort of countenance outright rejection of Supreme Court decisions. Right. So I don't know where that leaves us, in general. So, I read an interesting paper lately about the Supreme Court and presidential power. It was Brown and Epstein. So Lee Epstein with another USC law professor, I think, where they show that, in terms of presidential wins, Trump actually didn't get very many. So when he was in office last time, he had one of the lowest win rates of any modern president. But the Roberts Court is fairly stingy in terms of wins for presidents compared with previous courts. And so what the two do in their paper is kind of dig into that question of like what drives the justices' votes in cases involving presidential or administrative power. So they look at all of the cases where the federal government is coming to the court, which, has its own issues, but the patterns stay the same if they get rid of the administrative cases, blah, 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 whatever. But one of the things that they come away from that analysis with is yes, the court will provide a check on presidential power, but the court maybe does so by aggrandizing itself. And maybe that's not also what we want. And they also show that there's like this really strong partisan effect. And so the individual justices, when they vote for or against a president, are very strongly affected by partisan coincidence. So like, co-partisanship and loyalty to the president that appointed them. And that's, so that's kind of hidden in the raw data of this sort of less than friendly court to the presidents. So like, because of like this polarization in our country and the fact that we know the justices are polarized in a partisan way, in a way they've never been before, as is the public, as is the Senate, as is, everything hyper polarized, right? Hyper partisan. Even if the court were sort of predisposed to check presidential power, what are we going to get instead? Are we going to just get the court sort of trying to take over things? And is that what we want?
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is an interesting point as it relates to, this must be something that the court en masse, but like particularly Roberts, don't envy him right now, but must be considering is beyond just making decisions and having some type of a constitutional and legal justification for it. They are weighing the political environment as well. And right now, about to take office is Trump with a vice president in Vance who quoted, I believe it was Andrew Jackson, that if that Trump should just ignore Supreme Court decisions he doesn't like, and if the court doesn't like that, well, then they can find a way to enforce it.
Right.
And I take that pretty seriously. So I imagine that if nothing else, that serves as a warning to the court to restrain itself to some degree when it comes to orders against Trump. And I think that does worry me a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we take, the paper's finding in tandem with that comment by Vance, so we know that those three justices that Trump appointed are, more inclined to defer to him. Plus this, we know that Chief Justice Roberts is concerned with legitimacy. Those things could work together to make the court, more deferential or at least avoidant, right, of some conflicts that they might engage with in other circumstances or under other circumstances. So
this might be asking the same question in a different way, but is there anything that you can see on the court or related to this term, this upcoming or the term, I suppose, that we're in the middle of or at the beginning of already, that makes you think that, the court could play a role that might make all of this okay or maybe not? Well,
I mean, I guess so. Some people have talked about a little bit about the, so contrary, I guess, to the paper I was talking about, some people have talked a little bit about the weakening of the administrative state and the potential that weakening, which is actually something that obviously Trump is in favor of and that Republicans and conservatives generally are in favor of, might actually work to sort of limit the impact that some of the things that Trump wants to do might have, right? So if he wants to do some of these things that would require administrative agency decision-making or executive branch implementation, they might not be able to do it because of the weakening of the executive branch. I don't know if I don't know if I've given it enough thought to come out on one side or the other, but maybe that's right. Maybe that's a lining of some sort that maybe resembles silver. But, on the other hand, there's some cases before the court this term where I would expect that the Trump Solicitor General will come in and switch positions that involve regulation and that will then seek to deregulate, right? And I think, administrative law, I always joke, I had a student who was studying administrative law for her PhD, and I always teased her that it was, so boring, and oh my God, why are you studying administrative law? Shout out to Kimberly if she's listening. But I mean, really, if we really think about the impact that these administrative agencies have on everyday life, tinkering around with some of the things that these agencies can and can't do, and the people that run them, and the powers that they have and the regulations that we allow them to make, especially in light of a Congress that isn't necessarily interested in rulemaking at a specific level. So there's lots of gaps to fill in other words, by agencies who are experts on these things. When we start to really think about those things, I think we really underestimate the importance of some of those things. So if you just think about like Medicare or something, for example, or Medicaid, right? I mean, as you, I was going to just use bad words. As you say, weaken the bureaucracy, healthcare decisions that are already difficult, through the agencies that administer Medicaid, are going to get worse, which is going to lengthen the amount of time that people have to wait for decisions to be made, which means that at least people's health will be at stake, and probably also people's lives will be at stake, right? So these are not tiny things to the people who are waiting for government administrations to make decisions about whether or not certain procedures or tests are going to be covered, right? So, to the degree that we have limited power, or we're continuing to limit power in these federal agencies, that matters. And so these cases matter, and the position that the federal government takes in these cases is going to matter. And not just to, eggheads that like to read Supreme Court decisions or that get interested in administrative law, but like, actual people, Sean.
There's this other side, or something else that's particularly interesting, not necessarily a silver lining here, but we are definitely going to get a sense of maybe where Republicans, but definitely where conservatives on the court stand when it comes to states' rights over the next 4 years, as states, particularly blue states, are really gearing up to inoculate themselves from some of Trump's proposed worst excesses and policies. And those are all going to play out in the judiciary. So that might help formulate for the Republican Party that is reconstituting itself in Trump's image where they stand on that issue.
Yeah, and I think we'll, see very clearly that states' rights nomenclature is not actual reality.
Well, much like the Civil War was not about states' rights, it was about slavery.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's showing itself already with the abortion issue, right? I mean,
I've heard often like, well, they can't have their cake and eat it too, meaning, if it's either states' rights or it's not. But I do fear a reality in which it's blue states versus red states when it comes to states' rights. And that decisions somehow, that they thread a needle in such a way that it's harmful to blue states in ways that it isn't to red states.
How do you do that?
I don't know. But something tells me Thomas and Alito can figure it out.
I'll have to look and see what the Heritage Foundation is up to on that question.
It's Project 2026. That's what. Anyway, Okay. Let me ask you, are you looking forward to anything in the new year? I feel like this is a loaded question this year, but do you have any vacations planned?
I'm going to Puerto Rico. I heard it's a really nice place.
Then you've been living in a bubble.
Oh my gosh. I don't know.
Are you going to Puerto Rico?
I am. Yeah. The annual meeting of the Southern Political Science Association is down there. So I thought that'd be a great opportunity to go and contribute to their economy.
Yeah. Ma'am, why is your luggage filled with paper towel?
Come on, give me a little credit. Oh my goodness. I don't know. I mean, I'm just trying to focus on kindness and joy.
Well, I mean, those are not minor things. So
I mean, it turns out they might be the only thing that matters.
All right. Thanks for stopping by.
You are welcome. Anytime.
Okay, Dr. Watts, thanks for being here. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm well as well. We're both you're on the West Coast, right?
Correct.
Yeah. But you're almost as far south as you can go in the States, and I'm almost as far north. So I'm assuming our weather is quite different.
72 and sunny.
50 and rainy. Okay. Anyway, so since we last talked for After America, a lot's changed. It feels to me like a lifetime ago, but really it was just like 6 months or so ago, I think. And at that time, we talked about the state of American democracy, the importance of this election and its outcome, which we didn't know, obviously, but we do now. And I asked then of you if you thought we were past the Rubicon, which kind of in retrospect and in the context of that conversation assumed that Trump solely would be responsible for the demise or the future of American democracy. But the more I think about it, it really took decades of bad actors and norm breaking and rule breaking, erosion to bring us to this present point of, I don't know how you want to characterize our politics, rot, decay, chaos, whatever. So it won't be fixed in one election cycle either. It won't go away in the absence of just one figure. It'll take a long time. And the first step, I would think, is to either acknowledge the situation or, out of the ashes of complete collapse, collectively agree that we need to do something different to fix this. But that's not where we are. We're not even close to that. There's a lot going on. But one of those things is that one of the major parties, the Republican Party, has kind of fully abdicated responsibility for governing. And I think that that would continue under a Harris presidency as much as I kind of expect it to under a Trump presidency. So I guess I'd like to take the opportunity to ask you, given the outcome of the election that we now know, the state of our American politics, and your research, or overlaid with your research and expertise in the events precipitating the fall of Rome, through that lens of history, how do you see the American experiment playing out right now?
I think the idea of how things play out in America after this election, it's really on one level not surprising at all, and then another level I think quite surprising. So for a very long time we've been talking about the challenges to American democracy. We've been talking about this really directly. A lot of people have been talking about this for the past 8 years or so, but people have been talking about it more generally since the 1990s and these challenges from the Gingrich era. So we knew that that's a risk, and we know that it still is a risk. In a strange way, though, the election of Trump with a majority of the vote actually, in a way, reinforces the democratic institutions that we have because he did win, right? There's no question. Nobody is saying that this was a stolen election. Nobody's marching on the Capitol. I mean, he won. But I think the other side of this that we're beginning to realize is there's a different sort of challenge to American life that is reflected in the question of why he won. There, I think, is a deep, deep alienation about how American life functions and about the systems that make American life functional. And this is something where in the last year, I just finished a history of the Roman state from beginning to end. And what is remarkable about this is the Roman state lasts for 2,000 years because it has institutions and systems that Romans value enough that, for the most part, they decide to reform and allow those institutions to adapt to new realities instead of blowing them up and trying to replace them with something else. And that's actually, even more than democratic institutions, that's what makes a state survive. And that's what makes a system of living and a set of understandings about what your world produces for you. That's what makes it endure. You have these baseline systems that guarantee that every Roman in the 3rd century or in the 6th century understands more or less, if I do this, I will get this result. And what's challenging right now with the Trump election, but also the number of people voting explicitly with an understanding that Trump was going to challenge or destroy some of those systems, is Americans have lost the faith that Romans had that these institutions can actually govern their lives in an effective fashion. And we didn't know that this was a real risk. But when we look in the long term, I think we can see that there are a lot of people responsible for getting us to that point who we didn't realize were responsible for causing problems. The person who jumps out at me from talking to my students is Bill Clinton. A lot of my students blame Clinton for, in one of their words, they think he's stupid, not because he's intellectually stupid, but because he's incredibly short-sighted. And he did a bunch of things 30 years ago that hollowed out a lot of the institutional supports that Americans had. And now we're beginning to see what the actual result of that is. A deep, deep disaffection with the rules that govern American life and the institutions that govern those rules. And so I think that's a threat and a sort of challenge that probably none of us appreciated at the end of October or early November. I don't think we appreciated how deep and sincere the desire to just scrap things in the United States actually is. And that's a challenge we're really going to have to face moving forward, because states can move to be more or less democratic. And the rules that govern life and education and the payment of pensions and the way that vaccines are distributed don't necessarily change very much. But right now, all of those things are really going to be challenged. And we have to really decide if we do feel that aspects of the American system can work better, but don't need to be fully replaced. We need to argue and fight for that, because there's a real risk that that decision is going to be taken away from us.
So I want to look at this from another angle, which is maybe less gracious on the part of the American public, which is, or maybe it's just an extension that concerns me, which is there's this first ring. I don't know what's a good metaphor here, like a stone in a lake. I don't know with the ripples, but like the first ring is essentially the attack on the system, right? Mm-hmm. But then there are ripples that, it's a second and third ring, and those are the impacts that has, and then what you do as replacements. And I feel my fear is that so much emphasis is on dismantling or destroying the system, and no emphasis is given. I think to some degree, reporters ask Trump and his acolytes, Obamacare is a perfect example. Okay, you want to replace it with what? And there's just no answer, right? Yeah. And I think people maybe have this false hope or faith that there will, of course, be a replacement, because to some degree, our system, maybe for a couple of decades now, was so stable and it was built so in such an enduring way that we have been able to skate by on, fumes while we're slowly dismantling it. But I have a fear that there will be a day at which people that are not experts are administering Social Security or Medicaid, and checks are not arriving, right?
Right.
And that feels like a much bigger threat than just the dismantling of the system if there's nothing to replace it with. That's what I'm afraid of.
Yeah, I am too. I think what the Roman example shows is, if you try to replace something, you might get something better, but you probably won't, because you've had a very long time to figure out how to address problems in the system that you have. And the system might not be perfect, and it might not even be working very well. But if you design something completely new, it's very unlikely to work perfectly. It might, everything is possible, right? It might. But if you try to replace the way that things have always worked with something completely different, there will be unforeseen consequences and there will be problems. And if you take people who are experienced in running those institutions and you throw them out and you replace them with people who do not know how those institutions work, even if you're being charitable and assume that those people are intelligent and capable, they do not have the institutional knowledge to be sure that your Social Security check arrives on time. And that's going to be a real problem. I think some of the Roman examples that you see it's rare for Romans to take an entirely functional system and scrap it. But when they do, it doesn't work very well. And there are real struggles and real problems with creating something new that will actually meet the needs of citizens. But what is equally bad is when the system is slowly eroded through corruption. When the Roman state actually collapses, the collapse is actually it lasts just 25 years, because you have a state that is so powerful in 1181 that it stretches from Croatia to Syria. It's a very, very powerful state, probably among, if not the most powerful state in Europe, and certainly in the region it occupies. 25 years later, it's gone. And it's gone because the institutions and the ways that the state worked had been hollowed out over the preceding 100 years. And Rome had the benefit of good leadership until 1181. And then as soon as you got bad leadership in, the whole thing just came apart very, very quickly. And that, I think, is the real risk. If you have good leadership that functions within institutional frameworks, that leadership can guide the state very well, even if the institutions are not working super well. But as soon as someone who's bad comes in charge, a strong system can still function with a bad leader. But a weak system and a bad leader is just a recipe for disaster. And I think the wholesale replacement of a system when you're unsure about the direction of the politics in society is absolutely a recipe for catastrophe, because nothing will work.
So I guess I want to follow this train of thought a little bit and maybe put a finer point on it, make this a little more tangible. So as much as we can, knowing what we know and expecting what we expect as a result of this election, And if it in any way tracks with the collapse of Rome, what to you does this election portend? What do you expect to happen maybe over the next couple of years, or what could happen?
Well, so I think there's two parts of me. There's one part that is extremely pessimistic, that says that it is pretty clear, I think, what voters wanted. They are unhappy with how things have been working for a very long time. And I think it's quite remarkable, the sort of Obama, Bernie, Trump vote. It is remaining really, I think, pretty enduring and pretty strong, because these are people who want things to be radically different. And ideologically, those voters, they don't make sense in the ideological framework of the traditional party system. They have some very liberal ideas and some very conservative ideas, but they are unhappy with how things work. And that's a very strong constituency, and it seems to be a pretty stable constituency. And so what would be ideal is for somehow government to get together and to figure out how you address the concerns of those voters in a fashion that is tangible, and that does actually make a system seem like it's more fair and responsive to their needs, especially the needs of young people. What I'm afraid of is, looking at the rhetoric and we're talking on December 20th. So we're talking right when a budget deal fell apart because of more or less Elon Musk.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't look like there is going to be a deliberate, well-considered, evidence-based process for making things work better so that the Obama, Bernie, Trump voters feel like they are getting a fair shake. It looks instead like we're going to be playing kind of chaos ball in a really significant way with like just about everything. And will that blow things up in a fashion that expresses the anger that people feel about a society where it doesn't feel like most people are being taken care of? Yeah, I mean, it will definitely be a nice catharsis, but will it make things better? I have very strong doubts about that.
Let me ask you this, because I'm a pessimist, and the more I think about this, I've spent quite a bit of time, and I think a lot of people have. The framing of the current predicament we're in is the United States as a global superpower, as a quote unquote empire, as the world's longest and strongest democracy, in danger of decline. And I'm starting to wonder if the question is the United States as this package already and has been in decline for a while?
Yeah, this is a really challenging question. I think in some fashion, yes, the United States has been in decline for quite a while. I mean, I think, going back to 1973, when the economics of the oil shock really changed the way that our society was functioning. But I think that decline, the question about decline is always, what are you measuring? Mm-hmm. The Romans were very, because they always looked back to the institutions that they inherited and they valued those institutions, they were always looking back and finding things about their society that they felt manifested a type of decline in Rome. Decline means sort of change in a particular way where you put a value on it. Manufacturing capacity, to a degree, kind of defense capacity. Yeah, the United States has certainly declined since 1973. In other ways, though, it has definitely changed in fashions that some Americans certainly believe are progress. I think the long-term question about the United States, especially in this moment, is if it can stabilize, if our policies can stabilize, if our political life can stabilize, if we can get people in government who represent that vast middle of the country that basically just wants to know, if I do this in 5 years, my life will be better because I followed these rules and I did what I needed. That, I think, is the majority of the country. That is not what either political party is speaking to. And I think that if we can get to the point where we are again having conversations that relate to the expectations of that vast sort of political middle ground, where people just want to know how their life is going to be better and what rules to follow so that they can make their life better, I think we can stabilize things. And I think what the future will look like is, decline in some aspects, but progress in others. What I worry about is that the blow it all up mentality doesn't really stop, right? It starts a chain reaction. And so if you blow up the Department of Education, Well, I mean, most education is actually funded and determined on the state level. So the federal Department of Education, I suppose you could blow it up and it would make a change in American life, but it wouldn't dramatically disrupt American life. But I think it could start a chain reaction that sweeps through uncontrollably to the point where who knows? Who knows how that stops, right? Does California suddenly decide we're not going to actually observe Supreme Court decisions because the Supreme Court is not legitimate? Does Texas decide, well, there's electric vehicle mandates, but we don't want to observe that because it's bad for the oil industry? There is a point where disruption becomes uncontrollable because all of the institutions suddenly become subject to this idea of radical change or like, let's blow it up and scrap it and replace it with something else. That's my worry is if you start scrapping things without really thinking about what might replace them, and without having a plan, what you're doing is basically just gutting systems and kind of hoping that things will get better without actually being accountable for producing anything that's better. It becomes very easy to just scrap thing after thing after thing.
Have you ever seen that meme? There's different variations of it, but of like somebody coming off onto land from a boat and they're like smiling and whistling and behind them the boat is exploding.
I haven't seen that.
The reason I even mention this is because I feel like my next question for you, this puts people in this position, but what's something you're looking forward to in the new year?
I'm trying really hard to be optimistic. I really am. I do think that one very important thing that I think everybody who has studied pretty much anything related to the political world or the historical world, we have realized that the models that we have and the frame of reference that we use is not big enough to actually capture the moment we're living in. We really have to think in new ways because, again, it's not just the United States. Institutions and countries around the world are experiencing this same thing. If you look in Europe, the German government just fell. It's quite possible the AfD is going to take power. The French government, the prime minister was just forced to resign. It's quite possible that the National Front or Mélenchon on the left is going to take power. Institutions everywhere are really struggling. We have lived in this remarkable historical moment after World War II where there have been international rules and norms. There have been domestic rules and norms. There have been basic kind of human rules and norms that have been built up over the past 150 years that we assume matter. And they don't seem to matter anymore, right? The International Criminal Court drops indictments on leading figures around the world, like leaders of countries. And people just sort of assume, yeah, well, that's not actually going to be enforced on Putin or Netanyahu or anyone else. The institutions are struggling. And we as thinkers, as historians, as political scientists, we don't have models for that. So if we are able to step outside of that and think creatively, there are a lot of new things that we are going to learn. I don't really like the realities attached to learning those things. I'm very pessimistic about what those might look like, but we are going to learn a lot. And at the end of this, there's going to be political thought, historical thought, and I think artistic expression, unlike anything we've seen in a very long time, because new experiences drive creativity, new experiences drive new realizations. We're going to understand the world a lot better at the end of this. And when that happens, also artists are going to be unshackled in really remarkable ways. Whenever this ends, I think humanity is going to have a whole lot of really interesting things that come out of it. That is no way of saying that I'm happy that we're in this situation. But looking forward, I do think that there's going to be some really remarkable things discovered about how humans work, about how societies work, and about how one represents that. And so does that obviate all of the problems that I think are coming? Not really, but I think it is something that we can look forward to.
Dr. Watts, thanks for taking the time. And here's to raising a glass to the light at the end of the tunnel.
For sure. Thanks, Sean.
Dr. Hawdon, welcome back. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well as well.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. What a year, huh?
Yeah, it's been interesting.
Okay, so I think a lot of discussion and conversation and hand-wringing about violence and political violence, especially related to the election and the outcome of election, was framed in the context of a Trump loss. So, like, what happens if Trump loses? You know, the space between the election and inauguration, and then, you know, given what we saw with January 6th and kind of the emboldening of a far right, but also, you know, militia groups, how that would unfold over the next 4 years or so. But Trump won, and I think it would be a mistake and it's a mistake that people, I think, are making, which is that at least we averted political violence. But before we get to whether or not we have, I guess I'm wondering what type of violence you were anticipating had Trump actually lost.
Yeah, well, I think there would have been the kind of protests, right, that would have erupted around the country, and it is very likely that had he lost, the narrative of that the election was stolen, and there's this deep state that is just trying to keep him out because he's an enemy of the deep state. So there would have been some protests, I think, immediately following the election, as soon as it was called and in Harris's favor. I think there would have been these protests, and the likelihood of those turning violent, I think, would be very high because, of course, when the narrative is there is this evil deep state is the cause of this, any attempt to control that protest, any attempt to keep it from becoming violent is just, of course, further evidence of the existence of a deep state trying to repress the will of the people, right? So it becomes a feedback loop that significantly increases the likelihood of any one protest becoming violent. So I think it would have started like that. But then I think the more serious acts of violence would have come around the whole certification process, and this both at the state level and then, similar to January 6th. I think there would have been kind of a replay of that event. Mm-hmm. And then after, assuming that violence wasn't successful in stopping Harris from being inaugurated, I think the violence then would have acts of domestic terrorism with, the extent to which probably, or at least hopefully, would not have been a lot of it, but I think there would have been some of it.
So Trump didn't lose, he did win. And like I said, I think there's a tendency at this point to think, well, at least the violence was averted. And I don't know that that's true, because I think that violence, particularly political violence, is kind of baked into the MAGA movement and to some degree the Trumpist equation. And you touched on this, right? Like the enemy is the deep state. Well, even given the fact that Trump has won, I think that he will always have an enemy in the deep state. And by that, I mean, he will, generate this idea that there is a deep state that he's fighting against. So then that translates to his supporters, an enemy of his supporters as well. So then I guess my question is, what are you expecting, or what are you going to be looking for over the next few years in that regard?
The notion that we escaped political violence or averted it, avoided it, is true if we're thinking about direct violence, immediate direct violence, right? We're not going to see a January 6th like event when the vote is certified, and we're not going to see that type of violence, come the inauguration or anything like that. But of course, there's different types of violence, right? There's institutional violence, and I think that there is the danger, given some of the rhetoric that President-elect Trump has used and some of the things that he attempted to do in his first administration, there is the danger for a more violently supported administration, if you will. And what I mean by that is that kind of the threat of violence, even if it's not enacted, the threat of violence against people who disagree with him, the media, the number of people that he is promised retribution against. Even if that's not enacted, the threat of it in and of itself is a form of violence, a form of political violence that, evoking the immense power of the state against the citizens and is a serious threat. And then when you're talking about like the militias and such that are, and I agree with you, I think it is baked into the MAGA movement. There is a possibility that these become, we have seen this before, like the brown shirts and the rise of in the Mussolini regime, right? The use of these paramilitary and extra state groups that provided legitimacy by the political regime, to kind of just instill fear and enact fear, right? And and if you think about like the Jim Crow South and the violence that was enacted there, it wasn't always direct. There was enough direct violence, of course, to with lynchings and things of this nature, that gave the threat of more violence credence. So, there'd be enough violence to make people take the threat of additional violence very seriously, right? And if you think about the Jim Crow South, the success with which the local politicians and such suppressed the vote. Just that in and of itself is a form of political violence. So I think that's what we might be running into in the next 4 years.
Well, I do wonder if it is just the next 4 years. I think this could be a Trump phenomenon that goes away with Trump. But I do have an abiding fear that this is, we've turned a corner, and this type of discourse and this component of political violence in our discourse might be something that we're just stuck with for a while. What say you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm gonna go kind of a hedge my bet here. I do think that you're right that we have turned a corner. That the rhetoric of political violence, I think, is here to stay for a while. If for no other reason, it is so prevalent on social media, which, of course, we, at least for the moment, will not limit that speech, right? So people are going to be exposed to that. But there is something about the MAGA movement, and Trumpism he is a charismatic leader, right? That is, if you think about, the forms of legitimacy, he is very much relying on, his charisma. And, he has very frequently talked against a kind of more rational legal form of legitimacy, and bringing up the notion and perpetuating this notion that there is a deep state undermines the rule of law, right? So he is very much a charismatic leader. And what frequently happens with movements that are started by charismatic leaders and that once they go away, that energy is just not there, right? And if you think about, not saying this, he's the only potential successor, but J.D. Vance just does not have a whole lot of charisma. He's not going to be able to fire up the base the way that Trump has. And so depending on how long he lives, I think that the longer he lives, I think the longer this goes on. And of course, after he shuffles off the mortal coil and moves on, the violence the rhetoric will linger for sure. But, as we've seen with the fall of lots of authoritarian regimes, especially ones run by charismatic leaders, which most of them are, there is a backlash to it once everybody kind of says, oh, whoa, did we really do that?
This is a kind of an awkward pivot, but what are you looking forward to in the new year?
At the moment, we have a family trip planned to New York to see a couple of shows, and my daughter is a theater major, and looking forward to her graduating. That should be exciting. But I'm also very interested to see what happens in the next year. I don't know if looking forward to it is the best way to phrase it, but I am very interested to see how this all plays out. Will the system of checks and balances actually hold up? That will be interesting to watch.
Yeah.
But in terms of fun, we really don't have any huge plans yet. So I guess I'll go with seeing my daughter graduate from college. That'll be exciting.
What aspect of theater does she?
Acting. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she's an actor. She's waiting to hear if she got a role in the spring play. That'll be exciting.
Well, that's good.
But yeah, she's a theater and English major, so she's gonna try her hand at theater, and then she has a plan B.
Well, we should probably all have a plan B.
Yes.
Dr. Hawdon, thanks for the few minutes of your time, and here's to brighter days.
Indeed. Thank you for having me.
The gravity of our current moment is impossible to ignore. Like Rome before us, we in the United States stand at a crossroads where the choices we make or fail to make will have implications for our democracy and also for global stability, implications that will have repercussions for generations. The defense of democracy isn't the responsibility of judges, election workers, or politicians alone. It falls to each of us to recognize that democratic institutions don't collapse in an instant, but through the collective silence of those who could have spoken up, should have spoken up, and didn't. This is surely what the vast majority of Germans considered upon the collapse of the Third Reich. Italians after the Mussolini regime, Cambodians after Pol Pot, Ugandans after Idi Amin, Chileans after Pinochet. We stand in a place right now where we face that uncertain, potentially authoritarian future. So as we enter a new year, now is the time to ask yourself, when history looks back on this moment, which side of this struggle will you have chosen? All right, check back next week for another episode of Deep Dive. Chat soon, folks.